Okay, so good morning, everyone. Just to maybe summarize where the discussion was going, because a couple of people asked me afterwards to sort of try and help them contextualize what the points I was trying to bring out were. We were looking at the influences of science or culture or the environment at the time of the giving of the Torah, and what, if to any degree, this impacted on the form that the Torah takes. And we discussed in previous weeks that whilst this sounds like a very cutting edge and somewhat controversial question, on some level there's no debate around this. I mean, the fact that the Torah teaches halachas with scenarios at the time, with shor shenogach hasapara, with oxen goring cows and so on, is not a controversial matter. Nonetheless, there's a lot to think about this, and the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim certainly takes this further, in which he argues that even though the value behind the thrust against avodah zarah is clearly one that's integral to the Torah, the expression of many of the chukim and the way, for example, the Torah fights avodah zarah was to do with the norms that were prevalent at the time of avodah zarah. And this doesn't contradict the nitzchias, the eternity of the Torah, because the value behind it is eternal, and maybe the halacha will stay eternally. But even though the reason or the basis of the halacha perhaps will eventually become less relevant, and in essence, one can perhaps even say this is a kiyum of the halacha. The halacha has reached its culmination, reached its purpose. Though again, as the Rambam stresses in his Zikrim, and it's important therefore for us to be sensitive and very careful around this subject. The Torah, the eternity of the halachas of the Torah is not up for negotiation. We then saw other examples of this where perhaps it gets a little more controversial. We saw the thesis of Menachem Rabinovitz with respect to slavery, made famous by Rabbi Sachs's Talmud, in which he argues that there may be values in the Torah where the Torah gives a reluctant acquiescence to something. It says slavery is mutter, even though it doesn't consider this an ideal, because that's the way things were at the time. And the Torah instead puts in place a system which hopefully eventually will move us away from this value. In essence, this is really found in Chazal with respect to Yefas Torah. So again, Yefas Torah is a reluctant acquiescence and acceptance of a situation rather than an ideal. And nonetheless, the Torah accepts this. This is other examples of cultural impact. Rav Kook with respect perhaps to vegetarianism and so on and so forth. Last week, I argued that, and 2 weeks ago actually also, that some of the recent archaeological finds, the format of the encampment of Egyptian pharaohs as they went out battling their enemies, and in fact many portable temples at the time that seem to mirror somewhat the structure of the Mishkan, which again would indicate that the Mishkan is being set up to consciously imitate and copy the style of worship at the time, or the style of honor given to kings in the portable palaces of pharaohs at the time, and channel that into Avodas Hashem, which fits the theory of the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim that much of Korbanos can only be understood by seeing it as a channeling of ways of serving pagan idol worship and directing that to Hashem, saying, no, we shouldn't worship these lamb, these sheep, these goats, the Seirim, these demonic figures, but rather we should sacrifice them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So again, this would be another example of a quasi-cultural impact on Torah, because the structure the Torah gives to even Avodas HaKabonos, sacrificial worship, which is really very important and very central to Yiddishkeit, even that is impacted by the influence of the time. We then set out to look at some of the later, more recent, when I say recent, I still mean within the last century, recent discoveries of texts that were floating around the ancient Near East, such as the most famous of them is Hammurabi's Code, but I mentioned a couple of others also. And again, parallels or supposed parallels found in them to the Torah. And I said that in terms of a threat to our emunah, I don't see any particular challenge from these. The idea is that societies at the time, other societies at the time, were dealing with similar sort of legal situations. Shouldn't be surprising, of course, that these are the circumstances at the time that are being addressed. Even if there are some parallels, we don't claim an exclusivity to knowledge of Torah. On the contrary, the Ovis went around trying to teach Torah to the people at the time. There was wise people around who had versions of Torah, Shem and Ava, Melchizedek, who had versions of Torah. The non-Jewish nations, the B'nai Noach, are expected. One of the Sheva Mitzvahs, B'nai Noach, one of the 7 Noach High Commandments, is to have dinim, to have a system of justice. And therefore, again, one would expect this, according to many Rishonim, by the way, that means a Torah system of justice. The majority of viewers, it means any system of fair justice. But the fact that this parallels somewhat the halachas in the Torah, again, shouldn't surprise us. And more than that, it's possible that some of the halachas in Mishpatim are best understood as a response to prevalent legal codes at the time. So if one wishes to create a system for Klal Yisrael, perhaps we could understand why the Torah stresses particular features which are different to that prevalent at the time. I gave one example in which the ear of a servant is cut off, a slave is cut off if he wishes to leave his master in the codes at the time. And in our Torah, on the contrary, we pierce the ear of the Eved if he says he wants to stay with the master because we value freedom. We spoke of the Psukim in which the Psukim emphasize that a child doesn't get killed for their parents' sins because this is a prevalent social norm at the time, recognizably recorded in Hammurabi's code and other codes in which children are punished for their parents' sins. If a builder builds a bad building and it collapses and it kills the child, then the child of the builder should be killed, and so on and so forth. So again, why am I mentioning these? Simply to say that these are examples of where perhaps the structure or language that Torah uses, though not the underlying core value, is altered because of the circumstances at the time of the giving. So the core value that we value freedom, or the core value that a child shouldn't be killed for their parents' sins, is one that's embedded in the values of the Torah. But the stress laid in the structure, the particular mitzvahs by which it's mentioned, can be understood by comparing it to the culture at the time, and the Torah is coming to counteract that. What this really is opening up to us is no threat to halacha or to medrash or to drush or to remez or to sod. Obviously, the Torah is understood on a multi-tiered level. It's simply opening up a layer of pashat that perhaps we would be less aware of if we didn't know details of the culture at the time. And Baruch Hashem, since the uncovering of more information about what was floating around the cultures at the time of the giving of the Torah, helps us give a new pashat reading to the Pesukim, which we understand why Pesukim emphasize certain points, teach halachos with certain scenarios, because of the situation at the time. So this is simply opening up another dimension of pashat. And I belabor this point, forgive me, simply because I know I left some concept meatos and so on disturbed or unclear about the points I was trying to say. And this concept that we have an enhanced appreciation of the pshat and the psukim because we understand circumstances at the time, again, is explicit in the Rambam. In the Rambam, the Rambam says, I did my best to understand everything I could about Avodah Zarah at the time. And he says, by Hashem, if I would have known more, I'm sure I would understand more of the mitzvahs of the Torah, the remaining mysteries which are left unresolved in the Monavuchim about how halacha works and some of the dynamics of the halachas of the Torah. I would understand more if I knew about the I would understand more if I knew about the Avodah Zarah and pagan practices at the time. So this is really coming from the Rambam, who tells us that we're allowed to look at what was going on at the time, and this can help us enhance our appreciation, at least in the pshat level, of the understanding of the psukim. Again, I'm not claiming over here that this is the stance of the majority of the Rishonim or the majority of Jewish thinkers over the generations. I'm simply claiming that this is a legitimate way of looking at things, and certainly for those who are bothered by these questions or wish to engage in these questions and are interested in these matters, the Rambam is a profound source for answering them in these ways. I was also asked on Shabbos about the datings that I mentioned of these documents and how reliable these datings are. For now, I was simply taking the academic consensus without challenging it, which is that these predate Matan Torah by several hundred years, though they don't predate the Ovis. They're literally around the era of the Ovis, around the time that we talk about Shem and Eva, Melchizedek, and the Ovis teaching Torah and so on. So again, we don't know the causal chain of influence. Avram in the Torah is described by the Bnei Ches as Nasi Elokim, as the Prince of Hashem. The Pasuk tells us that again and again, Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, he called in the name of Hashem. So presumably both this Vayikra b'Shem Hashem and this title of Nasi Elokim, a Prince of Hashem, means that he's a well-known teacher of Torah. He's going around and teaching proto-Torah or some version of message or values that time with what he believes. He's therefore a prince of God. He's someone everyone knows. The B'nai Chais know. He's going around trying to teach people theology, belief, mitzvahs, whatever it may be. So again, the fact that these ideas that are floating around the Middle East at the time, it fits very well with the current dating of a lot of these codes. I didn't challenge the dating of these codes because it's not my field. I'm not an academic, and it's not my field to do so. What I would say is, and maybe this is something we can speak about more fully in another series when we look at biblical criticism, what I would say is that when one studies many of these fields, one can't help but feel, as a lay reader, that there are questions that can be asked around some of the claims that are made and some of the dating that's made. And maybe if we look at biblical criticism in more detail, I will try and share why I think a lay reader can be somewhat skeptical about some of the conclusions of these sources, and why this isn't an inappropriate stepping outside one's fields of expertise. So for people to step out of their field of expertise and not accept expert opinion in a field is always something one has to be very cautious about. And I will explain why I think this field is a little different. But for now, I'm simply going with the conclusions drawn by the academics and historians, and I'm not challenging them. But I'd be happy to sort of look at in depth at some of the research around this and why I actually think some of the conclusions can be challenged. But for now, that's not what I'm doing. Let's move away from the realm of halacha now to the realm of the stories of the Torah. Is it possible that the stories of the Torah are influenced by the culture and circumstances of the time? So again, it depends what one means by that question. If one means that the stories are affected by what's going on historically, well, of course they are. Avram behaves with a certain way in this interaction with the nations living in the land of Canaan, because those are the nations that are living there. If different people would have lived there, he would have behaved differently with them. He interacts with Ona, Eshkol, and Mamre. He interacts with Sodom. He goes to war in the battle or to rescue Lot, in the battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. He does all sorts of things which are obviously affected by prevalent norms at the time. In that sense, the question isn't controversial. Similarly, with Noach, is affected by what's going on in the contemporary practice. So in the most moderate form, nothing controversial about the question. In the most extreme form, if by this question I mean, is the Torah affected in the core narrative of events that it says by prevalent non-Jewish culture and mythology and so on, again, this would call into question the historicity of the Torah, and that's certainly not my intention. I'm assuming obviously the historical accuracy of what the Torah is telling us. However, is it possible that the way the story is told and the emphasis put in the story and the purpose of telling the story and which stories the Torah chooses to share with us is impacted by the culture at the time? Again, I think that is possible, and one possible Peshat level reading of the Psukim. Look, when we read the Torah, the first Parshias of the Torah span several thousand years of human history. In Bereshit and Noach, we get all the way through to approximately 2,000 years, and we're told a handful of stories. We're told at great length the story of the Mabul. We're told at great length the story of the creation of the world. We're told very briefly, 11 Psukim in all, the story of the Dor HaFloga, the Tower of Dispersal. And then we're told snippets of details about other characters. We're told about characters that were the inventors of musical instruments. Just when the Torah lists the genealogy of 10 generations, it happens to throw in there's a figure called Chanuchis, and Kim. There's another figure who creates musical instruments. It tells us tiny nuggets of information of 2,000 years of history. So we can certainly ask what the purpose of these details are. When it comes to the genealogy of Esav and Ishmael, it tells us Aluf this and Aluf this, and Melech this and Melech this. It tells us something about the royal families and noble families and ruling families of these people. And again, on a Peshat level, we can ask what the purpose of these episodes are. So the Torah chooses very selectively over roughly 2,000 years of history, a tiny number of incidents that happen. Presumably there's very rich history in 2,000 years. Presumably as much happens as has happened in the last 2,000 years, the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Middle East and the Evil Era and then Tudors and Stuarts and everything. History is always selective. So what the Torah chooses to share can be questioned on a Pshat level. And a possible way of dealing with this is that it's addressing some of the myths that were floating around at the time in that part of the world, and giving an alternative, more accurate, or more on-target messaged version of those events. And again, we will look at the parallels between those, if you like, secular, they weren't secular, they were also religious, but alternative religious narratives, and how the Torah tells them. And I will argue that in line with the Mona V'chim, this gives us a Peshat level, better understanding of some of the instances that the Torah chooses to share, and helps us understand this. And on the contrary, we should see this as another bracha of our era, that we have access to this sort of information, and it's able to give us an enhanced understanding of what the Torah is doing and how it fits into the whole plethora of texts that were around in that era. Yeah.
When we're looking at this particular snippet, as it were, that Avram's encounter with Nimrod is the Torah silence.
Yes.
And we're talking about events that are happening in that particular time, yet the Torah doesn't mention it.
Absolutely.
And it's strange.
Yeah.
That particular event is omitted.
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned pre-Ovis era, but when you get to the Ovis, you're absolutely right. Also, in the lives of the Ovis, I mean, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they live very, very full lives for between them several hundred years, and the sum totality of information we're given is very, very minimal. I mean, we know Avram and Yaakov, who we know more about than we do about Yitzchak. We still only know several episodes from their whole lives. And perhaps the most famous story of Avram, which we would certainly find the most interesting to know his origins and where he comes from and stories of his youth and so on. The most famous story that children are brought up about, with the encounter with Nimrod and everything, is Torah History as a medrash. It's alluded to perhaps in the Pasuk with two words, or custom. So if you translate or custom as the area called of the custom of the Chaldees, then maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. If you translate it as the furnace of the custom, then maybe the story is hinted at to in one word or two words. So it's absolutely remarkable, and it needs a lot of study which stories the Torah chooses to tell us and which ones not, and why. So absolutely. So there are many answers obviously that can be given to these things. I'm not here in any way claiming this is the only explanation of these facts. The list of the genealogies of the kings, for those who are familiar with the writing of the Mekabalim speak at great length about, and it's a very significant amount of Kabbalahs around the pre-Jewish kings and the idea of Malchus. They see this as representing an alternative form of kingship, which Hashem obviously has the kingship, and the Shviras HaKelim, the rupture of our ability to receive divine flow and so on. There's many other alternative layers of explanation in the Torah. That isn't our purpose of our discussion today, but for the purposes of our conversation, this gives us, I think, we can take insight into some of the psukim in the Torah by looking at what else was going on around there. And here I'm just going to share, again, I think this need not be said, none of this is my own original research, it's simply my reading. But there are two texts particularly that have been outlined, brought to light by academic and secular researchers and used to challenge the Torah. And the challenge that's put forward is, well, you see, these are basically the same stories as the story the Torah has, and therefore the Torah is, in a sense, simply cutting and pasting prevalent myths at the time. And I'm going to argue that there are superficial resemblances between the stories. That is true. But when you look at the underlying message and nature of the story, these are radically different. And what they can represent to us as Ma'aminim are simply other versions of events that were around, which the Torah is coming to, if anything, contradict. It's coming to tell us the story happens, but in a radically different way to the way it's quoted at the time. And perhaps on the contrary, should reinforce our emunah, because we see that these stories, the story of the Muddle, for example, most famously, is something that was known about to people at the time, but simply given a different explanation. And by the way, this would be very common in the modern era also. A tragedy happens, something occurs, whether tragedy on a grand scale, like some of the tragedies of Jewish history, or an event on a small scale, like a famous church in Paris burning down. And you will hear 50 versions of events. Different versions will stress different aspects of it, and different theologies will interpret it in different ways. So one person will say, this is a punishment for the people that are engaged in it. Another person will say, this is an act of providence. Another person will say, this is a scientific coincidence. This is well, obviously, there are going to be hundreds of narratives around these events and different aspects stressed. And the Torah will stress certain aspects of the detail and give it a certain theological explanation. A pagan will give it a different theological explanation. Say, this is the act of pagan gods. So again, I'm arguing here that the purpose of this series is not an attack on biblical critics. We can have one separately on that. I'm simply arguing that these stories, if anything, help us see that these were stories that were known at the time and can be given, were given multiple interpretations. It's very interesting. One of the attacks against the story of the Mabul, as people began critically assessing the authenticity of the Torah in the last couple of hundred years, was we find no historic record to it. And I'm not going here into the issue of archaeological records and the scale of the Mabul and other such things. That's not the point of my discussion now. But simply, there's no other records of it. When records were found, instead of saying, this is wonderful, we've now found alternative records of the Mabul, again, there's the same sort of double-edged sword that again and again is played when one reads biblical criticism, in which is that, so you just see that the Torah is simply repeating myths and legends at the time. But there is, of course, another alternative, in that there was a Mabul which entered into human memory in that part of the world. In fact, there's Mabul legends around the world as it happens. But let's now focus on the Mabul stories, which are very similar to the stories of the Torah from around that part of the world. And this entered into collective memory, and obviously over time, somewhat becomes distorted, somewhat changed, always given a pagan or different theological interpretation, in which a monotheist says this from Hashem and a pagan says this from the pagan gods. Sorry, Avram, you wanted to say something?
I've been thinking to be showing those things. Because if there isn't exactly what you just said, if there is a Noah story and it did happen, then other people know about it. So
absolutely,
that's the reason that they write about it in this way.
Absolutely, exactly right. So it's remarkable that this is used as a critique of the Torah. I mean, the mind boggles. And again, if I speak about biblical criticism, I'll try and explain why, as a lay reader, I do think we're entitled to read these works critically and not switch off out. Generally, when we read works of experts beyond our pale, we just sort of read what the experts say and so on. But I think in this field, it's a little different. For lots of reasons. I'm not here claiming that all historical questions around the Mabul are answered. There's many historical questions around archaeological records and other historical aspects. I'm simply saying this aspect of the challenge need not bother us. If someone's going to go off, don't go off because of this stuff. This is seemingly nonsensical, the claims that are being used against us. What I'm going to now argue, though, is on the contrary, this should help us understand Torah, and on a pshat level, as per the Rambam, give us a deeper understanding. So just briefly, what do we have around? So the fullest text that we have that dates, again, from the same part of the world, from Mesopotamia, the Bein Naharaim, Aram Naharaim region, the region between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, dates back about 3,800 years old, this text. So it's about 500 years before Matan Torah, and again, around the time of the predating of us, actually, by a little bit. So it's around the time of Melchizedek, Shem, Ava, these sorts of people. There's basically a figure called, it's known as the Atrahasis text, because there's a figure called Atrahasis, which we think means exceedingly wise. It's written in Akkadian, and it was found in, we've got it in various cuneiform tablets. It describes the creation myth of the world, with various gods that create the world. And at the end of So the story, the creation story is in tablet 1. At the end of tablet 1, it describes a world with overpopulation. In tablet 2, it describes the gods getting irritated by all this human noise, and a decision by the gods to send down at first a famine and then a drought in order to destroy humanity. And then in tablet 3, it gives a description of a flood that is sent by the gods to destroy humanity. And basically, there's one of the gods breaks ranks and decides to warn the humans about this. So all the gods swear themselves to secrecy, because obviously if humans know about this, they'll take steps to defend themselves. One of the gods breaks ranks and tips off Atrahasis, this very wise figure who's the hero of the story, about the story, and he builds a boat to escape the flood and takes into the boat animals, and he is the survivor of the flood. And by the way, it describes very similar. It talks about different decks. It talks about this boat being coated in tar, as per Noach, and sealing the boat closed, and the waters of the Tehom, the waters of the deep rising up, and somewhat analogous description of the story. So this is one version of the story that we have. There is another work This is the one that's most famous, by the way. If you speak to anyone on the story who's done any reading around this, they'll talk about this. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very, very famous, and amongst people that sort of read these things. Gilgamesh, by the way, is not relevant to the story. He's a either real or fictional ancient king who tells over various stories. And in the story, one of the stories he tells many stories. One of the stories he tells is about a character called Utnapishtim, who's the Noach type figure of the story. And in this story, again, the gods agree to bring a flood. Again, they make an oath amongst themselves not to break rank and share this with a human. Again, one of the gods gives it away and tells the Noach of the story to build a boat, which he does. And interestingly, into the boat he brings all the animals. After the flood is over and he lands, he brings sacrifices. The gods smell the pleasant smell. They're angry with the god that broke ranks, but in the end they accept that he has survived, and they gift him with immortality. He becomes a god. This Utnapishtim becomes a god and is elevated to the rank of god. So again, this is a second story of these. This was discovered, by the way, in very interesting. There was a library, an ancient library, a royal library in the ancient world called Ashur-banipal. Ashur-banipal, that's the library, which he was one of the kings in, it's named after the king of Ashur. Right? Ashur, we know, of course, from our history. Assyria is called in English. And he collected thousands of clay tablets as a library at the time. And amazingly, it was buried, and from the 1840s to the 1870s, it was uncovered and has slowly been interpreted. We're talking here about our part of the world. We're looking at near Nineveh and that sort of very familiar regions. So what do we do with these texts? So first of all, does this take away or add to the authenticity of the Torah? It really depends what prejudices or assumptions you bring to the question. If you are convinced that we live in a material secular world in which there's no possibility of divine intervention, in other words, the Torah is as much a piece of myth as any other ancient text, because there can't be the possibility of divine interaction, then you will say this reduces the authenticity of the Torah, because here you see it's just another myth amongst a whole family of myths. If you go into this as a Ma'amin, in which you believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, then on the contrary, these are ancient records, very remarkably, of very similar stories, which, look, our story is that everyone, or at least the people in the region of the Near East, are all descendants of Noach, and they're telling over there are other people that have a record of similar events. So, if anything, this increases our authenticity. I'm not suggesting we build our emunah on this. I'm simply saying this simply presents no challenge whatsoever to emunah. But then we get to the crucial point, and this is really what I wanted to bring out. The Torah does tell us this story. It presumably chooses to tell us this story for many reasons, but one of the reasons, and this is already mentioned by the Kuzari, is because this is a story that everyone knows around at the time. This is a well-known story, and if the Torah wants to give its version of the story, wants to explain to us what's really going on behind the scenes. And the differences between the stories are very significant. In the pagan version, there's many gods that decide to bring this flood. In our understanding, it's one God, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah is sharing a story, reflecting stories that are going around at the time that people know about, and it gives our version. More importantly, it represents a completely different hashkafa, and this is the point, because what matters in the story isn't just the technical details, but it's the mindset that you bring to the story, the values. How do you read the story? How do you interpret the story? Now, in the Gilgamesh story, no reason is given for the flood at all. In the Atrahasis story, there is a reason given, which is that the gods get irritated by the humans. By the way, I didn't mention that Atrahasis story, in the Bereshit version, in the creation version, says the gods create the humans to do work for them. That's why they want the humans as sort of assistants, slaves. So again, a whole different picture of why humans are created. Humans aren't created to give us the dignity of Tzelem and Akim, to give us the chance to achieve things. They're created as servants, as slaves of the gods. So no doubt, unsurprisingly, the gods get irritated when these pesky humans don't end up as very good servants. Not only that, but keep them awake at night because of all the noise they're making, because of overpopulation and all the cries that are used. Amazing. I mean, why would an ancient culture talk about this? Maybe they're worrying about overpopulation, right? They're worrying about scarcity of resources, but they're translating that into the story of the flood. By the way, very, very interesting. There's, as is well known, there's links between the Semitic languages that are floating around to that part of the world. The noise that the humans make that irritate the gods is described as tzaka or zaka. Two words that we know. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is vayishmanakim, right? We again and again, he hears the tzaka or the zaka of human beings, and he appreciates it, right? We're told HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves the tefillah of tzaddikim. He appreciates the crying out to them. These gods can't be bothered. They're irritated. These humans are, again, bothering us, right? It's this nundaki acquaintance that all of us have, who constantly asking us, oh no, he's calling up again with it, right? This is what the gods are viewing as the zaka, the tzaka of the humanities. This is, by the way, also reflected by the continuation of the story. So in the continuation of the story, post-flood, the gods say, okay, we're not going to destroy the world again, but we're going to take steps to prevent human fertility. And there's three things that they put in place, according to these legends, to stop humans again overpopulating the world. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to Noach after the flood? Right, repopulate the world. I want you to populate the world. So it's reflecting a whole different mindset, a whole different way of reading the story. And so what does this mean? There's a collective memory of a catastrophe that strikes people. And you read the story and you interpret that catastrophe in different ways. And the Torah is telling us how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants the story to be known. What happened from the correct point of view. So this is a whole different story. Again, the Torah tells us that the reason for the catastrophe is because of Chomos, violence and lawlessness and human wickedness and so on. Completely different to the version of the pagans. Why does the hero of the story get saved? So very, very interesting. In the Untitled Chapter story, we're told the reason he's saved is because he's Motzachein, he's a favorite. But there's no description about why he finds favor. He's just a favorite. God's a favorite because gods in these stories are quirky characters who pick on the favor. The Torah uses the same language of Chayin that Noach finds, but we're told why Noach Motzachein. Because he's Noach Ish Tatik Tamam Oivlersam. Noach isn't engaged in this commerce. So again, the Torah is infusing a story with values and with a message, because that's how the Torah wants the story to be understood, as opposed to this story. By the way, when the gods break rank and tell Utnapishtim to build the boat, they have a problem. Because if he's building the boat, everyone's going to ask him why he's building the boat, and maybe they'll also save themselves from the flood, which defeats the whole purpose. So they warn him, don't tell people about it. And they even actually, there's a discussion, they give him an excuse to explain why he's building this boat. They sort of give him a bit of advice about how he can hide it. In the Torah story, Noach is told to tell people about it, and he's criticized for not so doing. So we have the same event that the survivor of the flood doesn't tell people about it, interpreted in two different ways. In the pagan version, it's because he wants to keep it all to himself because the gods don't want anyone else to survive. And in our version, it's because I feel embarrassed using these words, our version. I hope not misunderstand what I mean. I don't mean to equate the versions. I'm saying in the Torah, it's because he's told he should tell people about it, and Noach doesn't do so because he doesn't have this mitzvah of Avram of Vayikra b'Shem Hashem. He feels a despair, he feels a hopelessness, whatever the reason is. He doesn't engage in doing this. The whole moral tone of the story is radically different. A moral tone of deceitful and vindictive gods out to squash humanity versus a monotheistic God who cares about humanity and wants to build up humanity and care about their moral compass. By the way, when at the end of the story, when the gods smell the reach nechoach, so the pagan gods gather around the sacrifices and they eat them because they're hungry. Why are they hungry? Because no humans have brought sacrifices for ages. And again, what's the purpose of humans in pagan stories? To feed gods, to serve gods, to look after them. It describes them, by the way, as gathering around the commoners like flies. That's the description he used. That's the image of this meat, this raw meat, and the flies all gathered around. So the gods gather around. And this is because, by the way, fundamentally, there is no intrinsic pagan respect for the gods. There's maybe a jealousy. The gods are the same as human beings. They engage in adultery and greed and fighting and jealousy and search for power. The only thing is, we humans are unlucky. We're mortal and they're immortal. They're tougher than us and stronger than us, and they're the bosses. But there's no fundamental respect for them. On the contrary, they're trying to use us, and our job as humans is to the best of our abilities to evade being overused by the gods, and as much as we need to, sort of placating them by giving them sacrifices and keeping them on board. And finally, by the end of the story, of course, Noach the Utnam Hashtin in their story is elevated to godly status. He also becomes divine. Occasionally, the gods can bestow that gift on people. In our story, very sadly, Noach ends up getting drunk. He lowers his status. Again, a completely different picture of what happens to a human when they go through a tragedy. When a catastrophe occurs and your whole society is destroyed. I ask you, Rabbi, so which one is truer to human? The message of the Torah about the impact it has on Noach in going through the story, he doesn't emerge as a divine being. He emerges as an all too human being who he's a tzaddik, he's a great man. Again, Chasron, we're not knowing his status, but he has a difficult time as a result post Noach. He doesn't go on and achieve perhaps what he could have in an ideal world. So these are two completely different stories, built around the same basic core facts of a universal flood, a survivor who builds a boat of sorts, brings animals into it, and is told by God or the gods to do it, with a completely and radically different moral and spiritual and theological framework around it. If anything, this should A, be mechazik our emunah, if anything, in the events that are described, and B, it helps us understand and appreciate what the Torah is doing when it tells us these stories and why the Torah is emphasizing different aspects of the story. I should have mentioned, by the way, there's also a Yonah story of it in which he sent out a dove. There's many more stories that, just for the purpose of simplicity, I've cut out here many parallels between the stories. There's an interesting study also about the numbering of how long the floods last between the two stories and other details, but I think for now I've made the points in terms of this text. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He starts off as Ish Elokim and ends up as Adam. On the contrary, he goes from being semi-divine to human. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Am I understanding right that the frame of the argument is that the Torah is telling you the right version?
The Torah is telling us that there are versions around, because this is perhaps part of collective human memory. Perhaps not, we don't know, but perhaps part of collective human memory. And the Torah is telling us the correct version of what happens for lots of reasons. It's clearly important for us to know this story for lots of reasons, but at least on a pshat version, a pshat level, we understand part of the reasons is because it's telling us the corrected version of these historic events and belittling of the Torah.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's like it's recognizing that something else out there is even worth listening to.
This is why I said I'm uncomfortable using the word different versions. But if you mean look, we know from history many sources, right? Whatever it means that there are non-Torah sources of historic events that are described in the Torah. Certainly when you get to the later periods of Nach, we know from external sources about Beis David, the royal family of David. We know about Ashur, we know about Bovel, we know about even figures that mentioned Koresh, Cyrus, and Darius, and these are well-known figures. And there's nothing wrong, and everyone does this, from the Gemara to the Gaonim to the Rishonim, to look at secular history and use that to understand better and contextualize better what's going on at the time. The Rambam argues that even in interpreting mitzvahs, we can do that. I don't know if you were here or you missed the beginning of what I was saying about it, but I've said it in previous weeks. Rambam argues even in understanding the mitzvahs of Avodah Zarah. If we ask ourselves, the Torah says, talk about Molech. If we learn more about Molech from understanding pagan practice of Molech worship at the time, then that helps us understand on a pshat level what the Torah is describing. This is explicit in the Rambam. I think it would be belittling if we said that there was all there was to the Torah, chas v'shalom. If we didn't recognize that there's multiple layers to the Torah and many levels of meaning and interpretation. But on a pshat level, if you want to read about the stories of the Torah, and we can understand what happened at the time. Look, we in Bovel, we now know from the archaeological record that they were obsessed with building tall buildings. We found the ziggurats, these very tall buildings all over the old part of the world, the same part of the world as the new one. So we know that they saw tall buildings as it was like an obsession, a way of showing power and might, and they built their temples like that. So again, just knowing that the story of the Darth Logger and the tower of Nimrod that's described there is an extreme, or the most extreme, or the largest and most significant part of a culture which is embedded with this sort of value of seeing tall buildings as a way of expressing human might and worship of Avodah Zarah and so on is fascinating. Again, I'm not claiming that this is the stance of the majority of the Rishonim, but this is certainly the stance of the Rambam. And by the way, the Rishonim often turns to outside sources for extra understanding of the Torah. The Ramban, who represents by and large a very different approach to the Rambam and is from the school of Mekabalim, is comfortable with using the insight of the Yevonim, the Greeks, and the science and the philosophy of the Greeks to understand Pesukim. So he speaks about the Keshes, the rainbow, and he talks about the science of that the Greeks uncovered of light, white light being split into many colors. In Ishak Yisazriya, where he's wondering what this term means, very difficult pasuk. Ishak Yisazriya v'yolda zacha, a woman who gives seeds and gives birth to a child. What is the zera there, the seed that's spoken about? It's not the way pregnancy works, seemingly. He speaks there about the insight of the Yevonim to help understand what these pasukim mean. So the idea of turning to outside sources to understand the Torah is a known one. By the way, there's a very I wasn't going to quote this, but if you asked me about this, there's a letter from Reb Shimshon Hirsch in which he's asked about some of the midrashim that tell us historical information and data that we wouldn't know otherwise without the medrash. For example, the story of Avram and Ur Kasdim. So he discusses how to learn medrash. It's part of a longer discussion how to learn medrash. When we take a medrash literally, when the medrash is metaphorical, and then trying to teach us a value. It's a big miktzah, really. It's a whole subject, and there probably is no one answer. Different rishonim and achronim, different thinkers will take different stances. One thinker will take a story that there's a marshal on the stories in Baba Basra. There's agodas there in Baba Basra that tell remarkable stories. So there's a mashal there that says that the stories have to be taken literally. Anyone who doesn't take them literally is it's sort of heresy, denying the historical accuracy. There's a Ritva and a Maral there that say, and the Maral, by the way, is a near contemporary of the mashal, who say, like, of course, these stories are metaphorical. Anyone who takes them literally and thinks they're talking about historical events is so there's considerable. Someone told me, by the way, many years ago, they once asked Rav Wolber, he said, "How can I know whether medrash is literal or not?" Rav Wolber was a Baal Musa, by the way, very, very modest man and a Baal Musa. But being a Baal Musa means that you tell people the truth as it is. So how can I know whether medrash is literal or not? So he said, you can't. You have to be a Talmud Chacham to know. that was his response. And I say that story as a serious story, which is he was making a point. You can't just know. You have to, if you're willing to invest, hundreds of hours into learning this sukkah and looking through the Rishonim and Achronim and on the sukkah and the insight that can be achieved, then you can voice an opinion on it. There's some subjects that need expertise. So Rav Hirsch is talking about and expressing his particular stance about midrashim. I hope no one heard that story as meant in the least. I meant that story as a story of comfort to Rav Wolber, because he said it as it was, and his response as it was. This is a field of expertise. I can't give you a 15-second answer to what's a radical question. The questioner, by the way, he told me the story. I'm not going to say his name on live. I think I understood that he found he wasn't upset by the story. He shared it with me as like an insight or an interesting conversation with Rav Wolber. So maybe I shouldn't have said this story if it was not meant in the least as Chas v'Shalom as Rav Wolber was a Baal Musa and a phenomenal individual. But Rav Hirsch writes a series of letters and pieces around this subject. And one of the things, so he speaks about when do we take a medrash literally, when don't we? One of the comments he makes is that it's possible that some of these midrashim represent pre-Sinai, pre-Matan Torah traditions passed down through the Jewish people, and that carries on through the generations. So it's possible that the people of Egypt were only several generations after Avram. They weren't. If you look at the genealogy, these are stories about their great-great-grandparents. Anyone who's descended from a very famed great-great-grandfather has family traditions and stories about their grandfather they know and they talk about, and these are carried on. So he says it's possible that the story of Ur Kasdim, he says it's possible it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's possible it's Chazal B'Doreshit from the Pesukim, and it's possible these were stories that were known amongst the Jewish people, not from Matan Torah, but just from folk memory of, I think he uses the word even folk memory, that's from memory that was carried on through the people of events that took place outside. Maybe there was Jewish information that's transmitted through the Torahs. That wasn't through Matan Torah, but just through traditions that the Jews knew about what happened to their grandfather. They knew they were Bnei Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov. They're very proud of their descent from these great figures, even though in Egypt they lost a lot, but they still had. And one of the stories they were told was about how Avram came to believe in monotheism and so on. So I certainly hope that nothing I'm saying in any way negates or is seen as diminishing Chashuvas Torah. I have one aim in all these shurim, and I mean that's sincerely, which is to increase Yiras Shamayim, nothing else. This is simply and I'm aware that a lot of what I'm saying is not spoken about generally by Rabbanim, and there's many reasons why it's not. One of the reasons is because many people aren't interested in this, and they don't need it, they're unaware of this. I'm simply addressing an audience that, and myself included in this, that is interested in this and wants to read these things and wants to not reconcile, it's even the wrong word, wants to integrate this into Yiddishkeit, and therefore for that I'm saying, I'm sharing some of this information. We've run out of time, unfortunately, so we'll stop there, and next week we'll look at again another famous text from the ancient world, the Enuma Elish. And then I will try and move on from this aspect of the topic, and try and look at some of the other examples of where contemporary usage of a style at the time affects the structure of the Torah. And then we'll move on to a different topic. But for today, thank you all so much for joining. I wish you all a good week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining online as always.
Thank you.